Now that the factions have found out what happens when you mess around with humanity and really piss them off, they decided to retreat from all other systems. Humanity only found this as they jumped into the next wave of systems they were going to take and found them empty. They were insanely empty, insanely quiet. There was no additional electromagnetic interference at all. There was no ships anywhere, just empty everything. This confused everybody, but also made them very much on edge. Why? Well, simple. They didn't want to get caught in a trap. They'd already seen that happen once or twice in this conflict, and they did not want to risk another battle group. Even though they jumped in from multiple sectors at the same time, one sector had a possibility of getting caught. They didn't want the factions to start using the same weapons that they had been using, which is why they hid them in the first place. But now they knew what humanity was capable of, and this was probably why they left. As each of the battle groups moved in from each side, they scanned for vessels. There was nothing, not even around the planets. They couldn't figure out what was going on. The spaceports were in non-use. There was not even an energy signature. It's like everybody decided to turn the lights out before they left. There was nothing there. The mining rigs that were out there as well, which don't count as spaceports but do count as their own station, were also abandoned. Most of them were adrift. Though the satellites were still active, they were very, very few of them, which made them very easy to clean up. A few precision hits from some of the battleships or dreadnoughts, and that was all she wrote. However, that didn't let humanity just roll in at top speed. No, they were constantly looking for mines, looking for the ambush, scanning for warp signatures of any type, any reason where they might be led into a trap. And this was making humanity very paranoid. Even the Allied soldiers who were there to watch were wondering why humans, so powerful, were being so cautious. When the humans were asked about why they were being so cautious, the humans simply responded, "We're just being smart. Because life is hard. It's a lot harder if you're stupid." Eventually, they would land on the planets and colonies in the systems and use not drop soldiers, but instead shuttles, corvettes, and frigates. The fleets held position outside lunar orbit just in case. They didn't want to be caught with their pants down, so they waited. What the soldiers found on each of these colonies and each of these planets horrified them. The very first thing any of the soldiers said when they left their transports and they looked at what awaited for them, "Medic!" The colonies had been stripped of all usable material. That included water, food, industrial equipment, all of it. But the slaves were left behind. Many of them emaciated, starving, or already dead. It was clear that the factions believed that technology was expensive, life was cheap. The bodies all over the ground of men, women, and even children as the humans walked in. Many of them are rushed towards the medical facilities, ran into the shuttle bays, anything to try and get some sort of aid to them, and many of them die in the arms of the soldiers as they desperately try to get them to an aid station, get them to a doctor, try to get some sort of IV in them, try to get any type of food, anything to save their lives, and the bodies would just go limp. They say you can't hear screaming in space. But standing next to one of these humans, you could hear them screaming through their helmet, a cry of sheer agony as those they came to save collapsed and died right there. If there was a dome colony that was breached, there was absolutely no survivors, as they had all just suffered slowly as the air ran out. On any planet's surface, it was almost worse. The cities, many of them, were struck from orbit. Infrastructure like bridges, roads, power facilities, all of them razed to the ground. Even a massive dam that made our own Hoover Dam look like something a child would make out of mud in a little stream was breached, blown up, seemingly shot from somewhere. There were obviously holes where they had missed, but the breach had happened anyway, and the dam collapsed. The resulting flood killed hundreds of thousands as it ran down several different valleys and coalesced into a small city. The city just wasn't there anymore. The wall of water that came down made the Johnstown flood look like somebody taking a leak. It was horrific. The crops, even the crops, were not spared, as some of the fields were still slightly smoldering as humanity came up. It was insane. Medical, recovery, and civilian fleets were immediately deployed to every sector. 24 systems had been stripped and left to rot, and this included a species' homeworld. And this act alone brought that particular species to the absolute edge of extinction. After retrieving those that had been rescued from other colonies, other ships, other sectors, there was a grand total of a little less than 2,000 remaining. Very few of them were females or children, as this species was primarily used as labor, as they were definitely not physically appealing. In fact, even to human eyes, they were gross to look at, absolutely disturbing. Yet they were strong, and they were tall, which made them excellent for what they were used for. Due to all this, the liberation of faction space was completely stalled. They needed to aid these planets, and along with that, they needed to protect them. They didn't know if this was a way to pull humanity's resources so they could take out the logistical supply train. Maybe it was there to try and cut off their medical, who knew? But they had to be watched over, which meant the warships couldn't move, especially since they were so close to the front line, and in a lot of cases, it was the front line. This held the entire invasion back for a full human year as all sorts of resources came in, infrastructure rebuilt, and, of course, the locals brought back so they could somehow reclaim themselves within their world and perhaps one day return to the stars. The next push found the same outcome. Somehow, the enemy is able to bug out before the humans arrive. Colonies and planets were doing even worse. Thankfully, there were no homeworlds. However, it was still a complete horror show. There were bodies, in some cases, piled on the streets. Locals left to deal with the resulting outcome, which always came out to one thing: cannibalization. Many of them would simply pounce on anyone that either was dead or looked dead enough, as starvation would cause them to do anything to survive, to feed the young ones. The young ones were not even close to safe either, as they were an easy target for others. This caused many of the populations of mixed species to go against each other, form their own little bands and factions to try and survive. Everyone understood this. But if they knew their survival tactics as well as humans did, they would realize the one thing that killed them faster than each other was disease. All of their water was contaminated. All of it. Some of it by accident, which was clear that some sort of chemical had dropped into it. Others seemed to be tainted on purpose. It seemed as though the slash and burn tactics of the enemy had done its job well, and they didn't even have to damage the entire planet. As long as they damaged it enough where the locals would kill each other, they were good. As more and more reports of this came in as they desperately tried to recover those personnel off the planets, the military leadership was extremely pissed off. Along with that, the Allies were just hoping for a chance to go after their enemies. This, of course, pissed off the grunts because they wanted a piece of the action too, but they were too busy saving civilians. As far as humanity's civilians, they were absolutely horrified at what they saw. This was enough to make the leadership hate the enemy enough to continue to push forward as soon as humanly possible. Even if the infrastructure was not completely done, they would leave one fleet, one small battle group to guard the planet just in case they failed. One fleet at the front line of each sector, and the rest of them continued. There was only one homeworld remaining in the former Mugensloot territory. It was a highly prized area, which meant it will be extremely well defended. When one of the commanders of the 18th Battle Group was talking to everyone, he wanted to know their opinion. What did they think? Did they think this was a good idea to go charging in as they were not fully ready yet? With that, one of the sergeants actually stood up. Instead of having his hands on his side, he raised them up towards his abdomen, and he seemed to be using his left hand to scratch his right index finger. He looked up, and with sheer hate in his eyes, he said, "It itches really bad, sir. There's only one way to truly take care of this itch, to make this itch totally stop." And with that, others started reaching for their hand and scratching on their index finger. The commander, looking at this entire group of soldiers, all of them in high-ranking leadership positions, all of them itching their trigger fingers, he knew that they were ready, regardless. This would be a combined assault, and as soon as it was possible to move everybody, they moved. They didn't wait. The fleet jumped into the system with a time on target designation. From different directions, they jumped in with all guns blazing. They aimed to take out the big guns first, which is any type of space station capable of reaching out and damaging their dreadnoughts and battleships. With this, they were able to take out several stations, and they also aimed for the enemy battleships that had started to arm themselves with cannons strong enough to reach out. This was a complete surprise to the enemy, and they immediately began to scramble. As the blast came in, the messages went out to the enemy fleet to stand down. And of course, this message repeated over and over again, letting them know that they will be treated with dignity and respect. They will be treated humanely. Although the enemy didn't quite know what that meant. All they knew was slavery and death, most of them. This is why, in their haste, they immediately warped in close to try and bring their turrets to bear on the human fleet along with their allies. With that, they're immediately blown to atoms by quantum flux reflex warhead weapons, and it is a massive, massive loss for them. The ships came apart also from the nanomachines that were sprayed across their fleets from different directions, and they were ripped apart by human turrets if they dared to even come close. The enemy had over 5,500 ships, to include 5 of those Titan-class command turds, as what they were affectionately called, as they did look like a flying turd in space. 24 stations ready to fire, 850 battleships, 1,200 plus cruisers, and the rest was an amalgamation of destroyers, frigates, corvettes, and whatever type of fighters and shuttles they might have. The humans began to push as Allied vessels arrived, and the Allied vessels deployed as fast as they could, trying desperately to join the battle line. Though the humans were taking losses, the lines continued to advance, unstopping, and with the same mechanical precision and determination that the Allies were used to seeing, they advanced. They advanced without any wavering for losses, it seemed. They patched their ships as they went on and just kept charging in. The enemy forces, seeing this, began to surrender, and as soon as one of the command turds surrendered, they all began to surrender en masse. Allied ships immediately advanced to take control of all these different ships that were surrendering. To their surprise, they were able to liberate 2 almost fully functioning command turds, 5 stations still operational, not to include any type of space dock, mining facility, or anything of that nature, 27 battleships, 204 cruisers, and an abundance of frigates, destroyers, and corvettes, though the numbers were much lower than they would have liked, as most of the ships were lost due to the foolhardy charge right into the nanomachines and the quantum bombs that were used against them. The nanomachines were actually busy still eating the ships, and a type of EMP needed to be used to kill off the swarm before humanity could even get through it, as it would eat their own ships. Now, it's time for the biggest drop of the war. This drop would be happening surprisingly fast, as they did not want the enemy to get any deeper of a foothold. Sonic weapons were dropped inside their spikes. Chemical irritants were dropped inside the atmosphere, but just burst as they got close to population centers. The focus energy weapons were aimed at the hardened facilities. Decoys, chaff, and flares came in right before the pods, and it was the biggest fireworks show that humanity had ever seen as the pods dropped through at amazing speed, dropping off all their different shells, popping off every so often to make sure they bled off the heat, but they needed to get down there quick. The corvettes and frigates weren't wasting any time. In fact, they were racing to try and stay ahead of the civilian shuttles already heading to the surface. The civilian shuttles, though armed, were not nearly as armored as they needed to be, which meant that the corvettes and frigates had to get ahead of them to try and draw some sort of fire. The shuttles were loaded with all sorts of civilians that wanted a piece of the action too. However, they were also loaded with an ass load of medical personnel. Because of this haste, the troopers, from the time they landed, had less than 5 minutes on the ground before the ships would make planetfall. This does not give them a lot of time. Busting from their pods, they were at least glad to see they had some sort of air support. Drones filled the skies. Some of these originally designed mainly for out in space, yet they could fly a little bit. They used their main guns, rockets, missiles, whatever they had, to take out the enemy air assets and then take out any type of hardened position. It was very common at this point to see a trooper running through an area, blasting his weapon away, taking down many of the enemy as drones fall flaming to the ground and seemingly explode all around them. Not true artillery, but more like fireballs. The troopers began to shoot anything not in chains. They seemed to have an unwavering determination to get this last battle over with. They seemed to delight, though, in getting up close and personal. With most of the hardened defenses already broken, it came down to hot fire and cold steel. Hell, they didn't even activate the energy shield on their blades. This meant that they were using cold steel in each of the opponents, and it would not slice through them easy. And many times the energy on the outside would simply seize them in a way that would make their organs explode from the heat. But now the steel would simply slice them open. But with the strength of the humans and their exosuits, they would rip those enemy apart open and they would bleed out slow on the ground. Many of them screaming in pain, holding limbs that had been blown off, or trying to hold their intestines and entrails from sliding onto the ground. From the video, you could see that the soldiers on the ground were shooting, slicing, stomping, and even strangling any slave master, any faction member they found. All this while the local slaves were too afraid to move at the sight of this demon that was coming through. This army of demons that seemed to have no regard for life, but some of them would stop and turn at the slaves and then just turn back and keep going, doing what they're doing. This was absolutely horrific for the other side, as they seemed to not be able to stop any, even holding themselves from a higher position from the few buildings that hadn't fallen yet. They thought they could get an angle. They wouldn't be able to be hit as they were up higher, and suddenly humans would come up using wings of fire to come up straight at them, firing their weapons at the same time, rushing into the room, ripping not only the weapon off its pindle mounts and throwing it outside, but seemingly with its bare hands ripping the enemy apart. From the inside, they heard a strange sound, which many would find out later was laughter, because everyone knows you can't spell slaughter without laughter. The planetary leader of this homeworld being held turned out to be the new empress from way back in the day. When she was captured, she was dragged out in front of the crowd. She was dragged kicking and screaming all the way to a waiting Corvette as many of the slaves took their broken slave collars and chains and threw them at her, a huge disgrace in her culture. She was simply lifted up and tossed into the cargo hold as her bulbous form rolled in there and seemingly stopped as the door shut. She didn't see another living being until she felt the ship descend into another gravity well. She knew she had jumped. This was a strange sensation for her, as it almost made her want to vomit. She was not ready for it. But now, where the hell was she? She didn't know. The troopers walked in and she demanded answers, but they didn't talk. They didn't say anything as the two troopers walked up next to her, grabbed her by her many arms, and then walked her towards the cargo bay doors. The cargo bay doors began to open up as they were still descending. The Empress thought they were going to fall over until she realized that there was some sort of magnetic hold on these suits. There was no way they were going to flop around. They were able to hold her down because of this, and not just the strength of their suits. It surprised her how the humans seemed to think of everything. That was the last thought she had, before the Empress was quite literally tossed down the ramp. She rolled down the ramp and then fell off and hit the side of the hill, rolling down the side of the hill as though she was falling into the Sarlacc pit. She didn't even see the Corvette leaving as it simply turned up and went away. She rolled all the way down into a wet form of sand. She was surprised. What the hell is this? Where am I? She looked up and she could see large chunks of melting ice, some of these as large as some of their buildings, but they were just there, melting away slowly. The air seemed very cool, which was pleasant to her because she was from a cooler climate, but she was surprised. She looked around for a while and she saw something in the mud. Something odd was sticking up out of the mud amongst the ice and the little bit of debris that was still around, usually shards of metal that couldn't be used for anything, except maybe a small stabbing weapon if they wanted to. She picked it up and examined it. It wasn't a tablet as she thought, but instead it was a piece of ceramic, completely blank on one side. But as she turned around, she could read the language. It was her own. And as she began to read it, a voice came from out of nowhere, seemingly reading the same line as she read it to herself. My name is Undimandamus, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. The new Empress turned around looking for seeing where in the hell that voice had come from. Eventually, she saw something moving, and it came into view. It was a truly horrific sight. The emaciated form of the first Empress was still there. She looked as though she had been on starvation rations for the past several years. The new Empress looked around and realized, well, she could have survived. There's water everywhere. I'm sure she could just take ice chunks to drink. But how could she eat? She looked over at the old Empress and asked, how did you survive? She looked close and she could see that the old Empress not only had this strange type of mushroom, similar to a lichen, hanging out of her mouth as she was chewing on it, but also there were several in her hand. The Empress looked around and couldn't see anything else. Is that all there is to eat here? The old Empress looked up at the new one. No, that is not all there is to eat. Ah! This was the last thing she ever heard.